So I got COVID pretty bad, so I've been watching a lot of movies, specifically Ridley Scott movies. Now, maybe I just subliminally chose Ridley Scott movies because he was like a meme for like a minute, like a week ago. But I don't really know why I chose him because I was in a literal fever dream. But I'm happy I went through it because at some point in my COVID spreading to my lungs movie marathon stupor, I watched American Gangster. It's an incredible movie. The writing is great, the acting, directing, music, it's all great. And the way that the filmmakers recreated late 60s, early 70s New York is in a league of its own. I really enjoyed it. And I think I found a neat little hidden message that I don't think anyone else has really ever discussed before. But this is probably only due to American Gangster just not getting that much attention, but that's what we do on this channel. We give attention to the things that don't get enough of it. Now, if only we could figure out a way to get some attention to the channel itself. But back to the topic at hand. I think the main character in this film, Frank Lucas, represents America. More specifically, Frank's rise and fall as a drug lord in Harlem represents America's involvement in the Vietnam War. Now, this isn't what the movie is most about. This parable between the American military and Frank Lucas is just a subtle little touch by the filmmakers that only shows up here and there. It isn't the main point. The film is based on a true story, and it did its best to tell it and show it in an incredibly realistic way. The film's primary function isn't to tell some grand allegory. It's about greed, crime, loyalty, legacy, duty, power, corruption, and so on. But while being about all these things, I'm saying that it also has a pretty cool allegory hidden within it. Again, our main character, Frank Lucas, represents America. I'll explain more in a minute, but first, let's go through the broad strokes of the story. The film begins in 1968. Frank is the right-hand man of Harlem mob boss Bumpy Johnson, which is an unfortunate name to have when growing up in the era of syphilis still being a thing. Anyway, Bumpy dies of a heart attack, leaving a power vacuum in the Harlem organized crime scene. Many people want to control Bumpy's territory, but Frank, being the guy under Bumpy, seeing himself as next in line, wants it for himself. How Frank is able to rise to the occasion and grab the power for himself is by bringing high-quality heroin into the neighborhood and becoming the #1 distributor. Frank gets the heroin from Vietnam, and through his cousin in the US military, he's able to smuggle it stateside. Poetically enough, Frank hides the heroin in the coffins of the dead soldiers returning home. It all works well for Frank. He grows rich and powerful. But in the process, he obviously becomes dependent upon the Vietnam War. He requires all the soldiers and planes to be stationed in Vietnam for him to ship his product into America. In fact, Frank's rise and fall matches up perfectly with the war. He begins moving the heroin in 1968 following Bumpy's death, which is when the Vietnam War really started to kick off. And Frank is taken down by the cops in 1975, which is when the war ends. When the American soldiers pull out of Vietnam, Frank loses his supply line. He loses his power, his money, and in no time, the cops are able to put him away. So, I think it's obvious that Frank's and America's involvement in Vietnam are related. I mean, historically, it's just a fact. But what I'm trying to say is that the movie puts a ton of effort into showing this relationship as if it's a parable, as if Frank not only relates to the Vietnam War, but symbolically represents it. The film's primary way of cluing the audience into this secret symbolism is done by showing timely news clips on the televisions in the backgrounds of scenes. For instance, as Frank gets his first massive shipment of heroin from Vietnam, thus starting the drug epidemic that's about to infect Harlem, the television shows news coverage of America beginning to protest the Vietnam War. A problem in both Vietnam and Harlem is beginning to grow.
The Vietnam War should stop, and the best way to stop it is for the United States to simply pack up and get out of Vietnam right now.
High purity of heroin throughout Saigon and the Far East leading to an epidemic of heroin addiction among U.S. soldiers.
News coverage of Vietnam soldiers addicted to heroin is shown, much like the images of heroin victims back in Harlem. Throughout the film, the TV in the background shows us the relationship between what's happening in Frank's life and what's happening in American life, and how they are symbolically one and the same. As the drug addicts die across town from Frank's product, Frank sits down with his family on Thanksgiving, with the suffering of the victims out of sight and out of mind, much like the innocent Thanksgiving Day broadcasts seen on American television screens of the time. Everything seems great and happy and jolly at the parade. Meanwhile, 18-year-olds are dying out in the jungle. During Christmas time, Frank is ambushed and shot in the arm. This is a totally new development in Frank's quest to rule Harlem. He's never been shot at before. It's never been dangerous.
We gotta do something, Frank. We can't just sit here.
We're leaving.
After being shot at, Frank's wife begs for them to just leave the neighborhood, to flee to safety with all of their riches, but Frank refuses to surrender. He refuses to leave.
Frank Lucas don't run from nobody, baby. No, we ain't going nowhere. We're gonna stay right here. We'll go right now, fucking kill him, whether it was him or not. You say the word, Frankie.
Opposite from his wife, Frank's men are telling him that he needs to not only stay in the city, but he needs to retaliate and kill anyone who may have been responsible. But Frank doesn't do that either. He refuses to strike back. And the television in the next scene shows Nixon discussing a Christmas-time ceasefire in Vietnam. Frank, like America, is divided in this moment. One side is telling him to hit back hard, and the other is begging for peace. Frank ends up landing somewhere in the middle, much like the president on the television.
I ain't running from nobody. This is America.
When Frank finally loses the war, when the cops finally shut down his operation and raid his home, the news on the television is discussing America's evacuation from Vietnam. But I think the most important, or at least my favorite scene involving these TV screens, comes right at the beginning of the film, when Bumpy takes Frank to a store that sells televisions. Remember, Bumpy is the boss of Harlem at this point, and Frank is just listening and learning. In this scene, Bumpy uses the store as an example of a problem he sees growing in America: the death of the mom-and-pop store, and how stores like the one they just entered buy straight from the source, selling their televisions for cheaper and putting the middlemen out of business.
I mean, what right do they have of cutting out the suppliers, pushing out all the middlemen?
Now, this speech that Bumpy gives here, this whole scene, it's important for many reasons. In terms of the main story, it gives Frank the idea to buy straight from the source in his own heroin business later in the film, but this scene is also about so much more.
Where's the pride of ownership?
Bumpy says this TV store isn't really owned by anyone. It's like nobody is there. No one is really in control.
You can't find the heart of anything.
Hey! Anybody here?
Forget it, Frank. There's no one in charge.
Right after saying this, Bumpy dies of a heart attack in the store.
Hey! Anybody here?
The store kind of represents Vietnam. It kind of represents Harlem. And if Frank represents America's occupation of Vietnam, Bumpy, the guy to come before, could represent France's occupation. The French were seen as the main occupiers of Vietnam before America, much like how the French Connection was the main way heroin entered America before Frank brought it in from Vietnam.
No, French Connection, Fernando Rey, the exporters that Frank has put out of business.
But anyway, back to Bumpy and the television store he dies in. No one's in control of Harlem after Bumpy dies. Frank and his ideas of going right to the source for the product is about to change this.
Pushing out all the middlemen. Buying direct from the manufacturer. Sony this, Toshiba that. All them chinks put Americans out of work.
And what is playing on the televisions in that store in Harlem in 1968 as Bumpy dies? That's right, the onset of America entering the Vietnam War.
Who are you really?
Frank Lucas says it right there in my passport.
I mean, who you represent. Who you represent.
The military is smuggling narcotics. That is how this event today will be interpreted.
Frank's conquest of Harlem is America's conquest of Vietnam. Even the first moment of the film, where Frank burns a man alive, even this could be a clue. It could be a reference to America's use of napalm in the Vietnam War, or maybe even a specific moment in history.
You gonna shoot me in front of everybody? Huh?
Come on.
Or the way Frank brazenly consolidates his power over the neighborhood by shooting Tango on the street in view of everyone. Similar to how the rest of the world watched America pulverize Vietnam for the better part of a decade. America kinda just did what it wanted and didn't really care who saw. Or again, maybe this moment in the film is a reference to something a little more specific. But in the eyes of America, all of this was justified. Before it moved in to attempt to establish order, the region was in chaos.
Things are never gonna be the same in Harlem.
How is it there now?
It's chaos, every guerrilla for itself, every guerrilla for itself, every guerrilla for itself.
Who can live like that? There has to be order.
Frank Lucas represents the American occupation that attempted and failed at quelling that chaos. Thank you, like, subscribe to all the stuff, hit the bell, hit the goddamn bell.